In the aftermath of the War of 1812, a sense of pride and determination seems to dominate the American scene. Pride that the nation has survived another war with Great Britain, and determination to avoid the mistakes that had weakened the country and placed it in such peril.
And this new generation of national Republicans then vowed never again. They're the ones then who would bring back the national bank. That is, Republicans who are reestablishing a Hamiltonian institution, because they see that the survival of Jefferson's union, a union of free Republican states, is impossible in a dangerous world without some institutions of federal authority that can effectively manage a war effort. So they were in favor of internal improvements, of canals and turnpikes, and in effect something like the interstate highway system, the infrastructure for national mobilization and defense, coincidentally for a strong manufacturing sector, and therefore the high protective tariff that would enable American industries to produce war material and to be really economically independent for the first time in American history. This was all the program that came out of the experiences of the War of 1812.
These issues of protectionism and the tariff are critical. I mean, it's hard to think that the tariff is so important today, but it was in the 19th century. So I'd say that you take a 50-year period, it's trying to protect the United States' security, fairly secure after the War of 1812. We know we're unlikely going to have attacks from outside of the country, but it's the economic instability and weakness that is most bothersome to leaders.
Fear of economic instability is also the reason Congress reestablishes the National Bank.
The Bank of the United States had been chartered with the idea that it would be sort of like the Bank of England and would exercise some kind of control over the national currency and would discipline some of the smaller state banks that were sometimes inclined to act irresponsibly, and could serve as an instrument of government policy by lending the government money whenever it needed it, holding the government's money while it wasn't being spent, transferring government money from point A to point B when you collect it at a port in New York as a tariff, and then you have to spend it to pay soldiers to fight the Indians over here or something of that nature.
The nation's most pressing economic need in the aftermath of the war, however, is for improvements in its transportation system.
The expansion of commercial opportunity, the fact that there was a demand for farm products in the towns and the cities of the East Coast and the towns and the cities across the Atlantic, meant that there were merchants who were desperate to buy these heavy, bulky things that you could produce on the frontier, whether it was flour or lumber or cotton or wheat or whatever, and get them to market where they could be used. So they were desperate to find ways to tap these rural hinterlands.
John C. Calhoun and other congressional leaders push for federal support of road construction and think they have Madison's backing.
Madison was deeply conflicted about the National Republican effort. On one hand, he seemed to encourage it, but then in one of the more fateful moments of his dying administration, he vetoed the bonus bill. The bonus bill would have used the bonus from the Bank of the United States in order to support a national program of internal improvements. And Madison says, well, Nowhere in the Constitution does it say you can do that. Calhoun, who had been a major proponent of this and thinking that he was enacting Madison's program, was appalled and shocked that Madison would turn against his own progeny. But to give Madison his due, he was caught on the horns of a dilemma, and that is, how can you maintain fidelity to the Constitution and at the same time establish a robust government that would be capable of meeting the next challenge? What both Jefferson and Madison thought on the question of internal improvements is that the states would recognize the necessity to amend the Constitution in a way that would give the national government these powers. But of course that never happened, and it couldn't have happened. But that was their delusion, that was their idea. Yes, we need to do this, but we can only do it with proper constitutional authority.
One reason for the growing interest in internal improvements is the dramatic surge in population west of the Appalachians. Once the War of 1812 diminishes the threat of Indian uprisings, settlers from all parts of the East migrate to what is called the Old Northwest.
What we're really seeing in the early 19th century is a population that has, in effect, been pent up east of the Appalachian Mountains for most of the 18th century. And then after the American Revolution and the defeat of the British and the Indians, the creation of a national government that could try to impose order and make a systematic distribution of land titles over on the other side of the mountains, there's this enormous expansion westward and enormous pressure to displace the Indians even further and to set up farms and communities and so on in the Ohio Valley and the Tennessee Valley and in Alabama, western Georgia, Mississippi. And you can document this in the land records. Farms have gotten smaller and smaller and more subdivided in places like New England during the 18th century, as you have very large families and no place to grow, and so the farms keep getting smaller and smaller with each generation. And then all of a sudden western New York and Ohio and Indiana open up, and boom, there's this huge rush to get out there as people find that those tiny little stony farms in the Northeast are just not enough to guarantee them the independence that they demand.
The promised land metaphor appears again and again and again. Lands of milk and honey, lands of where crop yields are incredible, where game is incredibly abundant, where livestock flourishes without being cared for, where the spontaneous productions of nature provide for a family's wants at almost no labor requirement. If the expectations of pioneers were set by the kind of propaganda, then no land would equal it. On the other hand, it was a land of considerable bounty if, and this is a very big if they could get it, if they could hold it, if they could acquire secure titles to it.
And there is a sort of romance to the West, but what we tend to lose track of, if you count where people go in the 19th century United States, this is a country where people move, but they're moving by and large to the cities. And even when they're not moving to the cities, when they're moving to agricultural areas, in fact, more people are going to Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan.
The Old Northwest is not the only area experiencing population growth. In parts of the Old South, overplanting and erosion force ambitious farmers to search for more productive land in the South and West.
What Whitney's gin does is to make the plantation system feasible in the inland South. It used to be that the only kind of cotton in America that would grow needed a very simple kind of gin to sort of squeeze the seeds out, but it would only grow on the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. The invention of the cotton gin was designed to separate the fibers from the seeds of a special kind of cotton that would grow everywhere. And when that machine was perfected, it was possible to grow this fiber in the inland South and not just in these subtropical areas on the coast. Well, that meant that you could expand the slave plantation system into areas where it had never gone before.
Cotton demands fairly large plantations, and so the workforces grow.
and the size of black communities who are on individual plantations becomes fairly large. Prior to the emergence of cotton is king, that's the phrase, the large plantations tended to be fairly selective and random, but that's going to become standard in what we call the Deep South, states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, parts of East Texas. The investments are enormous for the planters in terms of land, in terms of workforce, and they have to have a return. Very often, people's economic survival is riding on the ability to use these workforces and these lands to yield crops. If it works, you really are set.
But if you bet the wrong way and the price goes down, you can also lose your shirt. So that Americans go west to find liberty for themselves, but they find themselves in a much more unpredictable situation than they originally thought. They find themselves sometimes, at least, the prisoner of international markets rather than the beneficiary of them. Historians are coming to call that moment the market revolution, not because nobody ever did marketing before, but that large numbers of Americans who thought they were more insulated from what international trade was all about were suddenly much more hooked into it than they had been before. This offers tremendous opportunity for some people and tremendous risks as well. So it's this liminal kind of a scary moment where things could go either way and you just don't know what might happen.
In the territories that have been explored by Lewis and Clark, the draw is not agriculture, but fur trading.
And there was a great deal of money to be made in the fur trade. The first American millionaire, John Jacob Astor, made his fortune off the fur trade. And so this ignited great interest on the part of Americans to get to the West and to begin trapping those animals. But the fur trade was difficult for native peoples and always had been because of that traditional relationship that Indian people had with animals, who were their brothers, their sisters, their aunts, and their uncles. And then to be slaughtering animals in such large numbers changed the balance of power.
With the coming of the fur trade, there becomes increasing pressure on various species, especially the most valuable species, which do then get overhunted and do begin to get depleted in number. With the coming of Euro-American hunters, often men who respect almost no limits on the number of animals that they take and who waste considerable amounts.
The fur traders also established the first factories, became the trading post, and Indians became dependent on trade items. And so it tied Indian people in with the new people, and because of that relationship, there was a decline in the use of native items and knowledge about how to do things as you had done them before.
As the election of 1816 approaches, many people in the North are impatient with the ongoing procession of Virginia presidents. But the Republicans have no trouble electing yet another Virginian in 1816. It isn't even much of a contest. James Monroe, former Secretary of State and Revolutionary War veteran, is 61 years old when he takes office.
After the Madisons left, just having started to build a rudimentary structure, Congress and the federal government enters into what we might call its adolescence. And like all adolescents, it's sort of gangly and uncontrolled and rebellious. And there was this sort of power push. There was this need for power, but no structure to contain it. So people are scrambling, men and women of political families are scrambling, trying to create power structures and coalitions and executive committees.
Monroe's cabinet includes both Federalists and Republicans from North and South, East and West. These years are characterized as the era of good feelings. There is little political opposition, at least on the surface.
Even in this early period in the United States, it's become clear that the office of Secretary of State, held by John Quincy Adams, was the stepping stone to the presidency. But other cabinet members were constantly jostling for position. And congressional committees are starting to form as well. And they also see themselves as kingmakers and power makers. So Congress in some ways had the powers to pick presidents because of the way the election system is structured. But of course, a president would have the ability to elevate someone from Congress to the cabinet where they could have a shot at being a president. So the big story for the Monroe administration, as far as I'm concerned, is this growing relationship, this I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, between the cabinet and the Congress.
Monroe was not a terribly bright man, but he's of course, the last of the great Virginia dynasty in the emerging old Republican tradition of a strict constructionist.
James Monroe was very committed to retaining this Republican vision of the presidency as a powerless office. In fact, one of the things we know about James Monroe, he was the last president to wear the old-fashioned clothes of the Revolution, the breeches and stockings, which even in his day was considered rather quaint. But it was his way of indicating through his clothing that he was trying actually to take the presidency backwards to this Republican vision.
Some of the 19th century's more prominent legislators argue for a more nationalistic approach.
I think Henry Clay in the 19th century has a blueprint, an economic vision that, although not entirely realized during his lifetime, is important in setting the terms at which the national debate over political economy will take place. And a vision that stresses internal improvements in order to create a domestic market that would link West and East firmly together, that would keep the Union together, that would create high enough tariffs to protect domestic industries in order to encourage the development of domestic industries. That Henry Clay's is a vision that in some senses is the vision that ultimately triumphs, that the United States does in fact develop an industrial base.
After a brief but successful war against the Seminoles in Florida, Secretary Adams negotiates a treaty with Spain that surrenders all of Florida, plus territory in the Pacific Northwest, to the United States, in return for the country's abandoning its claim to Texas. This is a major diplomatic success, but there is little time to celebrate.
In 1819, there was a gigantic, what they call panic. Today we call it a stock market crash or a recession and depression. And people lost their farms, and there was a movement back from the frontier, and businesses went bankrupt in the cities.
There's considerable land speculation that has inflated the value of lands to unprecedented heights, and it collapses. And there are also all these banks that operate with very little of the kind of securities or checks and balances that we like to think our financial system now possesses. Meaning no gold or silver reserves backing any of the notes that they are sending out. And so when things begin to collapse and one bank calls in its notes, then another bank tries to call in its notes, everyone's calling in their loans, and at some point you realize that all this paper money that had been circulating has no value behind it, and the economy collapses, and it sets off a tremendous panic throughout the Ohio Valley, Mississippi Valley, the East Coast towns and farms and cities as well, and it leads to a tremendous political uproar, people demanding that they be protected from economic downturn. I think prior to that, many people thought, that there were no costs to the speculative economy. In 1819 and in the early 1820s, I think people come to realize that a largely unregulated market economy does not always rise, that it can also collapse.
For a brief but alarming moment in 1819 and 1820, the sectional differences between the North and the South threatened the unity of the United States.
For the early decades of the Republic, politicians at the national level anyway are pretty good about keeping slavery out of sort of national debates. They're pretty good about finding ways to create one compromise or another that allows them to put the slavery question off the table. When Missouri becomes a state, that escape disappears, and suddenly the divide between North and South becomes more pressing.
One of the assumptions of the Founding Fathers was that if slavery was able to sustain itself, that those parts of the United States that abhorred the institution, would always be protected from domination by the slave states. The assumption was that slave states would grow slowly because in many ways their use of slavery and their investment in agriculture retarded their growth, and that someday the northern states would be more populous, and that proved to be true, and they would dominate the Union and lead it more deeply into the values of liberty, freedom, and equality. But Southerners were too shrewd to be, sort of boxed in that way, and they will begin to demand early in the Republic that there always be an equal number of free and slave states in the Union to protect their ability to be a major force in the Union and to block any moves against their particular social order, including its labor system.
You had two very different societies evolving over the course of the late 18th and 19th century, and they really didn't come too much into conflict until when? Until you had the question of what to do with the national territories. And you find in every occasion when that became an issue, then suddenly slavery reared its ugly head. And the first major time that happened was over the admission of Maine and Missouri in 1819 and 1820, the Missouri Compromise that it's called. And so you had a debate. A free state was going to be admitted. Maine met the requirements. It was going to be admitted to the United States of America. For the first time, this would upset the balance between free states and slave states. There would be more free than slaves. And so this engendered a great debate and controversy. Missouri was ready to come in as a slave state. And in 1819 and 1820, it was, as Thomas Jefferson said, like a fire bell in the night when the explosion in Congress, in the press, between Northern and Southern people, it was greatly debated. What kind of country are we going to have? The North and South are set, but the territories are our future.
Ultimately, the Senate agrees to combine the Maine and Missouri proposals into a single bill. But before it can come to a vote, Senator Thomas of Illinois proposes an amendment prohibiting slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of Missouri's southern boundary. His amendment is adopted, and the bill known as the Missouri Compromise passes.
For them, the climactic moment was to whether new states coming in would be slave states or free states. But it was, in a way, a mechanical question rather than an ideological one. The deep ideological crisis of slavery developed more slowly over time. That is, they have to do with the way you see people and the way you treat people. That developed more slowly, and it was not something that this generation could solve.
And much as people like Henry Clay craft skillful compromises yet again to try to keep it off the table, to try to find ways that the issue won't become the battle cry of national politics, it comes up again and again and again.
The pervasive nationalism that characterizes the era of good feelings often disguises the deep sectional differences that exist within the country. Battles continue between those who favor a strong federal government and those who are suspicious of centralized control. In almost every instance, the decisions of the Supreme Court, now in its second decade under the leadership of John Marshall, tilt the scale toward nationalism.
They are very fearful, these more democratic-minded people, of the power that courts hold, precisely because judges often hold their appointments, often for life. There are also movements in these decades to force lawyers to speak in common, plain language. That it's often assumed that lawyers speak in this gibberish in order to confuse ordinary people. And so there are various kind of pushes to democratize the law, to democratize the court system, to make judges subject to election and to recall, to make the law more understandable. And this is, as I say, one of the great tangles in the early 19th century. It's one of the places, I think, where the contest over how democratic the United States would be gets played out.
Just as the Supreme Court is emphasizing nationalism in relation to the country's economic life, the Monroe administration is asserting nationalism in foreign policy, in response to the revolutions in Latin America.
Between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintain it, and whose independence we have on great consideration and on just principles acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States.
First of all, who is this one country, the United States, that can come out and make its claim that this is our hemisphere and this is the United States hemisphere, and they've sort of abrogated upon themselves the right to tell others we are the protectors of the Western Hemisphere. On the other hand, to the degree that the Monroe Doctrine provided at least a figurative shield for those involved in the independence movements in the Spanish America, all the better. We'll use it, although there was never a vote in Latin America saying, aha, we support the Monroe Doctrine. That's a legitimate document. That's a treatise that you can depend on.
As Monroe's second administration draws to a close, so does the era of good feelings. For a time, it had been possible for Americans to ignore just how different their perceptions of nationalism were, one region, one group from another. But the path of economic and territorial expansion on which the country is embarked will soon reveal how deep the rift is. The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.